What is the science of reading? What are leaders doing to accelerate reading achievement? We answer these questions and more in Science of Reading Leadership, Guiding Minds, Transforming Lives, powered by Just Right Reader. Get ready for an exciting new series as we explore the latest research you need to know as you kick off the new school year. It's that time again, and I am so excited. We are here for another episode of the Science of Reading Leadership podcast. This is our back to school series, and we are talking to amazing researchers who are giving us some great tips as we all prepare to go back to school. And today, I am super excited about this conversation because we get to talk to Dr. Francesca Smith. Dr. Francesca Smith is a multilingual education specialist and early literacy consultant. She's based in Washington, D.C., and her work centers around translating research to educating practice through professional development and teacher coaching. As a daughter of Mexican immigrants who grew up in a Spanish-speaking household in Texas, she is also very passionate about dual language education and working towards equity in and access to the gift of bilingual learning. I am so excited about this conversation. So welcome, Dr. Francesca. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited.
I love it. We were talking before we started recording about the fact that my daughter attended a dual immersion school and absolutely loved it. And I think that I love the conversation around this idea of multilingual education. I'm super excited to hear all of your research and what you have to share with us. And as we get ready to do that, as we get ready to talk to educators and those who are listening about going back to school and planning, I always like to start this conversation off by just thinking back to when you might have been in the classroom or when you were going back to school, right? What was that time like for you? Do you have any fun stories about this going back to school time?
Yeah, it's one of my favorite times of year. I started teaching through a teacher residency program. And I had gone in wanting to teach maybe upper elementary, ELA, or middle school, and I was actually placed in a pre-K classroom as a teaching resident. And so anyone who has ever been in a pre-K classroom at the beginning of the year, the first few weeks knows that it is not for the faint of heart. There was a lot of crying, a lot of fluids, a lot of patience. And I remember I still have a very long iPhone note on my phone of just like all the wild things that I would find myself saying or that kids said that was hilarious throughout the day. And it was always just very joyful. I was resistant at first, but I ended up loving pre-K, and especially those early few days of what a production it is and just how much energy it takes, and just all the incredible things that I learned as a pre-K teacher and from really amazing role models that I got to teach with.
I agree. I think people who teach pre-K and kindergarten, they're saints. When I did my teacher training, and I was getting to decide what grades I wanted. I thought I wanted fourth grade or fifth grade because I wanted to have these adult conversations, I thought. And I remember my professor was like, no, I think I'm going to put you in kindergarten. I think we're going to put you in kindergarten for the first semester, and then we'll move you to second grade. I remember thinking to myself, they're going to touch me. These kids are going to touch me. And they did. They did a lot of touching and a lot of hugging with a lot of snot, but I fell in love with that grade. Yeah. So you do a lot of work and research around multilingual education. And so I want to kind of guide the conversation. You guide it for us. You tell us what you want to really share. Would you summarize for us some of the key findings from your recent research that you think is going to really have the most significant impact on educators as they head back to school this year?
Sure. So I recently completed my doctorate at American University while I was still a first grade teacher at a dual language school. As a teacher and a doctoral student, learning about this transition to the science of reading and all the new curriculums that we were trying, all the new PD that was happening, how much I was shifting my practice. I was really thinking about where bilingual education fits into this model, and working with multilingual learners, and how we could consider everything that we were learning within not just a monolingual English lens. And so I was reading a lot about funds of knowledge and how a lot of bilingual education is based on really elevating kids' cultural beliefs and practices and language and translanguaging, and using all the resources that they have across both the English side and the Spanish side, as is the context that I've worked in mostly Spanish-English dual language classrooms. And so I wanted to know, like, how does this happen in my like reading classroom, like to the very specific point of like small group teaching foundational literacy skills in first grade, which is where a lot of that science of reading movement is right now, like using decodables and all that. How do we really meet kids' needs in this small setting? And so I completed practitioner action research, and so I was looking at how, like, practically can I take this research into my work as a teacher who was working with students who were learning in English for the first time. So they had completed pre-K and kindergarten all in Spanish immersion. The group that I mostly focused on was a group that also spoke Spanish at home. So this was kind of their first formal introduction to English reading. And so I took inspiration from a lot of work, especially from people like Elsa Cardenas-Hagen, who does a lot of work on like cross-linguistic connections and what are the things that are the same in English and Spanish that we can teach kids to take advantage of more quickly, and what are the things that are different. And so particularly in my classroom, I thought about, they're new to English literacy formally, but they've had, of course, English language exposure in varying amounts throughout. And a lot of them had learned the basics of how to read pretty well in Spanish, especially because Spanish is a pretty transparent, decodable language. And so I wanted to be, rather than just kind of being like, oh, they're going to organically take what they know, I wanted to be really explicit about, what are the letter sounds that are different, and how am I reviewing them more frequently within lessons? How am I making sure that I review English vowels and practicing saying the sounds in every lesson? What are the sounds that are the same that I'm going to tell students explicitly and have students explicitly compare, like, what does this sound like in Spanish? Is it the same? Is it different? And kind of making sure that I was asking those questions frequently, and they started to do it on their own, of comparing sounds and comparing it, how it was soft or hard, or, concepts from Spanish that applied to English. And I saw a lot of great gains in phonemic awareness and letter sounds and decoding. And it was really exciting to see how I could make like simple but explicit changes to really elevate, like concretely elevate what my kids knew from everything that they knew in Spanish literacy from their homes and from their classrooms.
I love the idea of A, simple changes, and then B, leveraging what they already have, right? Leveraging what they are already getting in the home, leveraging the skills that they've already adopted to learn how to read in Spanish, the skills that they've already adopted to learn how to communicate in their native language, and then leveraging those skills to be able to now bring them into the new experience of the English language, right? And also, the thing that I heard you said that was so powerful is being very explicit. Science of reading really does talk about explicit instruction. And what I hear you saying is that you even took it deeper than that, but being able to explicitly compare inside of that instruction what was the same and what was the difference between those two languages, and that phonemic awareness in both to develop the ability to really gain new information and new skills within the English language. And I think that that is super key, because what did you find? You said you experienced some really important gains, but how did that inform your research? Like, what were the specific maybe strategies that you used when you were thinking about those comparisons that you brought to your research?
Since I was mostly focusing on the phonics side of this, and phonemic awareness, kind of those foundational skills, while also, of course, focusing on language comprehension or language, which I'll talk about after too. But the data that I was mainly looking at was that, because that was kind of what they had gained very clearly in Spanish, that I wanted to see how we could translate it over versus thinking that we had to start from zero. And so I think one big thing I got kind of like, it was really fun to kind of get into the nitty gritty of the really like specific examples of we used the Dibble's nonsense word decoding assessment. And so I would look at not just like how many did they get wrong overall, like I would look at the actual word and see and like find and record patterns, and like, are they mostly missing the N sound? Are they mostly missing the I sound? Are they mostly missing, et cetera? And I found that a lot of it was around that vowel confusion and certain specific vowels that are similar but different in Spanish and English, and how, just how important it is to kind of take, maybe not to the extreme detail, because teachers don't always have time to look at every single one, but how important it is to look at that, especially with your multilingual learners, because I could look at that assessment and say like, oh, they're still scoring well below or below, but like looking at how they actually decoded all these words, they were able to blend them automatically, but maybe they're just like pronouncing the middle vowel sound slightly differently, but they are saying it with what they know in Spanish, or they're still working on that pronunciation. And I think kind of my main takeaway was that the consonants were a little easier to connect, and the different and similar ones, but just how difficult those vowels are for all of my students who were struggling with reading, including students who were English monolingual. And so I think that's a big adaptation that I made to my practice, is just like, how can we more consistently and just like in quick ways just practice saying these vowels, seeing them, listen just in phonemic awareness activities, and how helpful that was for a lot of my students. And so just as much vowel exposure as I could do, and it was really helpful for students, and telling them what I was doing and why, and how they kind of started to get that
and
ingrained.
That's important, right? That's really important. When we're thinking about being explicit in our instruction, it's really important for us to identify, where do I need to really lean in, but where as an educator can I say, okay, I have a couple strategies, or I'm going to need a couple, like 3, 4, 5 strategies to really hone in on these vowel patterns, because I know that these become a little tricky. So let me beef up my strategic approach to intentionally and explicitly teaching vowel patterns, where I can kind of cruise through my consonant sounds, because I know that those are a little bit easier to grasp. So I think that that's really, really, really important as we think about engaging students in these multilingual experiences in these classrooms. How do you see your research findings being applied in the classroom? And I think we kind of just answered this. We kind of talked about it, but let's answer the question even to the point, right? How can these findings be applied in the classroom? And then what practical advice would you give to teachers looking to implement those findings?
Yeah, so I think one thing is, just even if you don't speak the native language of your students, doing some overview of like of general similarities and differences, and knowing what you can elevate, and just doing something like that. Like if you know that all the vowels are different, like I'm going to make sure that I have a vowel warm up every day. And so kind of those practical changes in like, how can I really work off of cross-linguistic connections? And then also I think just that foundational literacy and biliteracy and oral language development don't have to happen in silos and shouldn't have to happen in silos, and thinking about how we can tend to these oral language needs that multilingual learners have within something that might seem like it's just phonics based when you're working with decodable stuff like that. If you take the time to make little changes, it doesn't have to be isolated language development and phonics development. Moving from being a practitioner researcher to kind of thinking about how do we put this research into practice in instructional coaching and consulting now. I've seen teachers do really awesome work, and really like even veteran teachers who had been teaching a certain way for a long time and very quickly switching and adapting practices, that then sometimes the messaging gets that like phonics is the only thing that we need to focus on in this time, and seeing like missed opportunities to think about like how do we also think about the specific needs and assets of our multilingual learners. I think about one example when I was teaching a student with a book that was talking about a boy who had some cats that got in the mud and then they had to go in the tub. It was like focused on the short U, and we had pre-read all these words. We had practiced pronouncing all these short U words. We had spelled some of them and read some of them, and we read the text and he was able to read it well. And afterwards, I think I asked like, what is a tub? And he was like, oh, I don't know. And it was like a key part of the whole text and the whole story. And I had, because he was a student who was pretty fluent in like classroom English, I hadn't expected him to not know this word, but he was also a student who spoke Spanish at home. And like, when he was talking about a tub at home, maybe he was talking about Latina, not like, why would he be talking about tubs at school, really? And so it just made me think how, I could have just at the beginning of that text made sure I was like, when we were reading the word tub, like, what is a tub? Showed a quick picture in the text. Like it was in the picture. So just making sure to draw students' attention to that, when so much of their attention in these early years is on like, how do I sound out and blend this word? But just little things that you can do to pause and make sure like, oh, what is this? Show me the tub. Like, what is he doing in the tub? That you can bring in students' oral language needs while also really heavily focusing explicitly on the phonics development.
That's beautiful. Dr. Sonia Cobble talks about those exchanges, right? Those 5 turns that we have with students to kind of delve into what they understand, that dialogic reading when we're having those dialogues, those conversations while we're reading. And I think that you did such a beautiful job of pinpointing and highlighting that, yes, being able to read the phonics is really important, but also remembering that they're little humans who are discovering and learning the world, and books are our access to the world. They're our access to new information, even if it's just a new, what is a tub, and having those conversations, even while we're teaching phonics, really is going to help us round out their experience with this language and with this idea that school is, right? School is a place for us to learn and grow and develop as humans. And I think that that's a key point to your point and your advice to teachers. And I think that's really important. This episode is brought to you by Just Right Reader. Extend phonics instruction, strengthen home and school partnerships, and accelerate reading achievement with Take Everywhere decodable packs from Just Right Reader. Personalized Take Everywhere packs makes phonics fun and accessible for families. Every book comes with a video phonics lesson and writing pages to help readers reinforce their decoding and writing skills. To learn more, visit justrightreader.com. I want to shift the conversation just a little bit to parents, because we are seeing a big focus on family engagement. We understand the research behind it. We know how important it is. So let's talk about how parents and caregivers can utilize your research to help support their students at home, especially as we're going back to school and as the school year is getting started. And we're thinking about these dual language and multi-language families. How can we as educators support caregivers, and how can caregivers support their students in this learning at home?
Yeah, so this is something that I'm really passionate about as well, and was part of my dissertation study was talking to some of the students that I was working with, interviewing their parents who were all Spanish speaking. And I asked them about their experiences supporting literacy at home and supporting students who were learning in two languages, and kind of how they conceptualized that and how they acted upon that at home. And what I found was that a lot of what they were doing, which was mainly in supporting with literacy and Spanish, because they had the awesome privilege of being able to do that in a dual language program, knowing that half of their day was really developing that Spanish literacy and language, was that they were doing a lot of things that were very aligned with like English dominant, like science of reading practices that we might think about, like dictations. They were doing a lot of that at home, and using silabarios, which are these like syllable books. They're common in a lot of Latin American education, and just like seeing that a lot of the traditional Latin American schooling strategies around foundational literacy is like very explicit and direct, especially because Spanish is so transparent. Like once you really find out how to sound out those individual syllables, like you can read a lot.
Yeah, exactly.
And so parents were telling me about this, but they're like, so oftentimes also like, oh, like we do this, like, you know, kind of like our old way that we know. I don't know if it's right. Like I use los métodos antiguos, these like antiquated ways. Or we're like, you know, I'm helping that with Spanish, but like English, I don't know. That's what we have you for. So I'm trusting you with that, which is totally fair. But I think also what I think that we need to do more of is like really acknowledging and valuing this to parents, that like what you are doing is directly, it's not just supporting Spanish, it's directly supporting what I'm doing in the English classroom. And you don't have to be reading in English at home if that's not your most comfortable language, in order to be like really directly supporting what I'm doing too. Mm-hmm. And so I think one thing is just like, and this is something that you can do, I think especially needs to be done in monolingual schools, that like just really explicitly naming for parents that working in supporting your student in your native language literacy, you know, is important in its own right, and like maintaining and supporting your culture and your roots, and like maintaining that for students, but also that supports English. And if that's what's most comfortable to you, then do that and really work on the vocabulary and the pronunciation and all that stuff, and the decoding that you can do, especially if it's an alphabetic language that transfers over really well to what we're doing in English. And something else I did as a part of my research that I kind of tried out was having like a little parent biliteracy workshop at the beginning of the year. We did these like kind of data workshops regularly at my school at the beginning of the year, to kind of, once we did all that beginning of the year data, like show parents their individual data and like kind of show them trends across the classroom and what does this mean, kind of translating it to parents. And so I kind of thought about like, how can I, you know, bring some of this that I was doing in my research around like the things that are the same and different across languages. You know, what do I want parents to know about that? And I told them like, these are some of kind of the overviews of how English and Spanish are very similar. These are some of the key differences. Like these are some of the key letter sounds that I'm going to be focusing a lot in the English classroom. That if you feel comfortable, you can review these, or you can just have those as a note, like asking your student, like, this is a sound in Spanish, like what does it make in English, having specific ones that you can review if you feel comfortable. And if not, then keep working on that Spanish literacy home, knowing that that it's not just serving the Spanish side, it's serving their full holistic literacy development. And so, yeah, I'd say like creating those spaces to explicitly validate parents for that, creating spaces to share across parents, community building across parents of multilingual learners. Like, what are you doing? What kind of Spanish resources are you using at home? And what are some routines that you're doing at home? I think whatever you can do to kind of break that monolingual expectation and really concretely value what multilingual communities and parents bring is super important.
And I would imagine that they feel so empowered, right? I imagine that they felt empowered, felt seen, felt appreciated, right? Because as parents, we want to help our kids, right? And when we get acknowledged and validated that our efforts are important, then it makes us even more willing to try new things or even go out and continue to support in all of the new ways that we might feel uncomfortable with. Because now, hey, you're telling me that what I was doing was a good thing. So now I'm willing to listen and even learn something different to help continue to develop my child. I think that's beautiful. And also the beauty of having those conversations, those parent nights, what an empowering thing to do for parents. That's really, really fantastic.
And I think, sorry, one more thing. I think also, especially that assurance for parents of students who were not necessarily struggling with English literacy, but still making the connections, because it's a range. It takes a varying amount of time. And I had some parents whose kids were reading super high in Spanish, and they came into my classroom and they just picked it up in English, or they had already picked it up in English before without formal instruction, just making the connections on their own. And when I talked to them, they're like, "Oh yeah, I don't have any worries. Keep doing what you're doing." And I think, but when I talk to some parents whose students were struggling, maybe in both languages or particularly in English, and we're seeing that data that was saying that they were well below grade level, I think they just very much supporting with them that even oftentimes there's research showing that the intervention with struggling readers should be done in their native language. So naming for them that if they are struggling, yes, keep working, but don't feel like it needs to be in English. So I think naming that for parents, and I think naming also that it's normal for that transition between languages to take time. It's not right away.
It's normal for it to be challenging.
And for teachers to know that too. Yeah,
it's normal for it to be challenging. It's normal for it to even feel challenging, right? And the acknowledgement of that, I think it's so, so important. I love that you really honored that and put words to it. I think it's a beautiful thing. What do you think are some of the long-term implications of your research when you think about student outcomes and how they can shape the future of education and the educational experience from the teacher perspective, as well as from the larger education perspective?
I think a long-term implication is that we have to keep really specifically thinking about how we connect the science of reading with the needs of multilingual learners and bilingual education. Oftentimes, all these curriculum does a great job of having, maybe a whole supplement on English learners or, a footnote on every page about it, but thinking about educators don't have the time to read this supplement and integrate it on their own, or, aren't going to have time to look at all the footnotes of how should I change this for my students? And so I think that we, the research community and especially the practice community has the responsibility to keep thinking of, what are these specific changes that we're making in classrooms that serve multilingual learners, or in bilingual classrooms, and making sure that they really live in teachers' practice. I think about this quote a lot by bilingual education scholar Guadalupe Valdez, who had this quote in a text that I was reading during grad school about how, we know that bilingual education is research proven to be powerful for language minoritized communities, but we have to continue finding exactly what is exactly that secret sauce what are the specifics about teaching in two languages, or the way that we teach language learners, that is really making the difference here, versus just we're going to teach in the two languages and let them make those connections organically. But I think continuing to really intentionally think about how does the science of reading really fit into bilingual education. It does, but what should be different in a classroom that really is teaching in two languages?
Well, this has been an amazing conversation. You have shared so many really powerful things in this conversation. And when we think about going back to school as educators, we always want to take as much as we can and implement as much as we can, because we really, really have the heart to do good things for kids. And so I want to ask you, how can we take all that you're sharing? What are the big key takeaways that you would say are the big things you want teachers to hone in on and pay attention to, especially as we're trying to balance everything that we've got, that we have to take in and adopt? What are some big key takeaways that we can start doing right now as we embark on making some of these shifts that you talked about?
Yeah, so I would say learn, again, if you don't speak your students' primary language, taking some time to inform yourself on kind of the basics, and kids will see that and appreciate when you take the time to use and honor their languages. But I think also just, again, in those practical ways of if I'm teaching foundational literacy, what are the key things that are similar and different, and how can I really incorporate that in my lessons? For example, in Spanish, a lot of the big differences are the vowels that I found that were really similar, but also the H, the G, the J. So again, just spending more time on those sounds that are going to be tricky, and not just in reading them, but also saying them. So I would say that's one thing. Another thing is, again, don't take oral language development out of foundational literacy. Taking the time for quick definitions, quickly pointing out a word, in this Tub book, if I had pointed that out while he was reading, maybe that could have helped him access the story better throughout. So just quick changes that you can make to give a quick definition, or if you're not sure, quickly asking a student, what is a tub? And maybe it'll surprise you what they do or don't know, that you can make sure you fill those gaps proactively. And then with parents, making sure that, again, as I was saying before, being explicit about literacy in multiple languages, again, for its own right, and being supportive as someone who wants to help a student maintain all their languages, all the languages and literacies that they have access and roots in, but also naming that for parents, that if they feel most comfortable supporting in Spanish or in another language at home, that is supporting their development in English as well.
That's fantastic. That's awesome. This has been a great conversation. I have loved it. You are so awesome. I just have loved this conversation. Is there any additional advice that you would give to teachers as they navigate the beginning of the school year, or as maybe they have some EL learners in their classrooms? Is there any additional advice that you would share with educators as they go back to school?
I would say continuing to learn and inform yourself in ways that are accessible and engaging to you, and honor your self-care, and finding ways to develop and learn more about your students, and learn more about deepening your knowledge and practice in a way that is science-based, but acknowledging that is very hard, especially right now in so many school districts that are throwing out new curriculum and new things and new strategies, and just all the hecticness of the beginning of the year. So I would say, finding a podcast that you like. There's so many like this one, but many more around the science of reading, and finding a way to fit one of those in once a week while you're driving or making your lunch or whatever, or talking to your administration about what is a topic that you want professional development or coaching around, or even just picking one area that you want to really shift your practice in and applying these learnings to, so that it's manageable. I think sometimes you'll listen to a podcast or read a book and go to a professional development session and learn so many things, and then don't have the energy or direction to actually change your practice. Awesome. So I think, picking, if it's small groups or read alouds, what is one area that I really want to think about how I'm applying these new practices.
Awesome. So where can our listeners find you? If we want to follow you and keep up with all the amazing things that you're doing, where can our listeners tap into you and find you?
So I'm not a social media person, but yeah, I'd be happy to connect on LinkedIn and chat with more people. I always love learning more and talking to more people in this space across the country. So I think that can be put in the show notes if anyone wants to connect and reach out and chat. I would love to.
Well, listen, this has been an awesome conversation. I have learned so much. I know that our listeners are going to learn so much. Dr. Francesca Smith, thank you so much for taking the time to be here. Thank you for the work that you're doing. And thank you for being a part of the Science of Reading Leadership podcast. We are so honored and so grateful to have you. To all of you who are listening, I appreciate your time. I hope that you too gained a lot from this conversation, and I hope you enjoy your first couple months back at school. Until our next episode and our next conversation, happy reading. Thanks for joining us. If you found this conversation valuable, please subscribe and leave a review on your favorite podcast platform. We will see you next time on Science of Reading Leadership, guiding minds, transforming lives.